Alzer's life was not the kind of life anyone envied. She was a widow, left alone to raise 3 young daughters in a mud house that leaned with cracks as if it too was tired of standing. Her husband had been gone for years, debts had piled high like unmovable stones, and the villagers treated her as though she were already buried. Dead weight, nothing more. Each day was survival. Each night was silence. Yet on one ordinary afternoon, when she set out to gather firewood near the edge of the forest, fate whispered her name. It began with a sound, not the rustle of birds, not the chatter of monkeys, but a low groan, raw and human, spilling from the bushes. Alzer froze, the bundle of sticks half gathered in her arms slipping to the ground. Her heart pounded as she peered closer, and there he was, a man. His body sprawled on the damp earth, shirt torn, blood streaking his chest, his face hidden beneath fallen leaves, as though the forest itself wanted to cover its secret. Fear crept into her mind. What if he's a bandit? What if it's a trap? What if bringing him home only invites ruin? The whole village would scorn her if they knew. They would shake their heads, call her reckless, foolish, cursed. But louder than fear came the voice of her soul, a quiet yet unshakable pull urging her to act. And with strength she did not know she had, she dragged his heavy body across the uneven path, one step after another, until her cracked house swallowed both him and her choice. She did not know his name. She did not know his story. She did not know what dangers she might have carried under her roof. But one thing was certain, this decision, made in silence and trembling, would change everything. That night, darkness fell heavy over her roof of clay, wrapping the small house like a thick, suffocating blanket. With shaky fingers, Alzer lit the oil lamp, its glow trembling as much as her own hands. The stranger lay unconscious on her daughter's straw mat, his chest lifting and falling with shallow breaths. Her daughters huddled close to the wood stove, whispering fears they could not name. Even the youngest, who could not yet read words, understood with her small beating heart that something dangerous, something unknown, had stepped into their fragile world. "Mama, is he going to die?" the middle daughter whispered, her round eyes full of both wonder and terror. Alzer swallowed hard, glancing at the man whose arms were marked with scratches and dried blood, and with a voice steadier than her own heartbeat she answered, "Not while I still have strength." The words came without thought, straight from her soul, not her mind. Earlier that day, the neighbor who often traded green bananas for soap had passed by, squinting at the sight of a man's shadow in Alzer's doorway. Her voice had dripped with gossip, sharp and poisonous. "Alzer, what's this? You're bringing men into your house now?" she had hissed. Alzer clenched her teeth, kept pounding corn with the pestle, letting each heavy thud drown the sting in her chest. When night deepened, she did not beg for gold or miracles in her prayer. She only whispered, "My God, make me a bridge, not a stone. Give me strength so I do not fail someone already broken." And when the lamp burned out, she did not truly sleep. She remained in her straw chair, eyes half closed, heart wide awake, keeping watch over him as though fate had laid a son at her feet. Her body rested, but her soul stayed alert. The wind howled against the walls, the house moaned with the weight of the night, and fear lived among them. But within that fear, something else was rising, something Alzer had not felt since her husband's death. The instinct to protect, to guard, to care, to not let another human being die alone as hers had. In the middle of the night, a sound startled her. A dry, tearing cough split the silence. Alzer jumped up, relit the lamp, and hurried to his side. For a brief second, his eyes flickered open. They were deep, heavy, filled not with evil but with loss, an endless abyss of grief. Then they closed again. Her heart trembled. The voices in her mind clashed. What if he is a thief? What if he harms you? What if the village is right? But above those doubts rose another memory. Her late mother's voice, firm and gentle. The just do not deny water to one burning with fever. Even if the world says no, God sees the gesture. Alzer understood this choice might cost her dearly, but turning away would cost her even more. It would deny the very essence of who she was. By dawn, the stove had gone cold, holding only the faint smell of the thin porridge she had shared with her daughters the night before. There were no leftovers, yet Alzer had saved a portion anyway, without even knowing if the stranger would eat. And as the first light crept into the cracks of the house, she already knew she would change his bandages, cook his broth, and face the whispers of her neighbors. That night had been harsh, long, and heavy with silence. Yet it was not filled with regret, because through every hour of fear and doubt, Alzer felt something inside her too was being saved. It wasn't joy. It wasn't certainty. It was peace. The quiet peace that comes when you do what is right, even if no one applauds, even if no one understands. And when the rooster crowed in the far-off fields, she looked at her daughters asleep and at the man still breathing with difficulty. And she thought to herself, if this is a trial, I accept it, because being a bridge has never been easy, but it has never been in vain. The sun was barely breaking through the mist when she heard the creak of the kitchen door. Her body stiffened. She rose slowly, her bones aching from a night without true rest, and saw him. The man was standing, or nearly so, leaning against the wall. His hands trembled as they searched for balance. His hollow eyes blinked, confused, as though his soul had gotten lost in the woods and hadn't yet found its way back. Alzer said nothing. Instead, she turned to the stove, rekindled the embers that had slept since the night before, and set water to boil with the last of her pumpkin and cassava leaves. It wasn't much. The pot looked too large for the handful of greens it held, but Alzer stirred it slowly, the same way she cooked for her daughters, each motion tender, like someone soothing a wound the eyes could not see. From behind the burlap curtain the girls peeked out. The youngest pointed shyly, whispering, "Mama, he has a sad face." The middle one, always more sensitive, whispered back with a knowing tone, "No, he's hurt on the inside too." Alzer nodded silently. She had felt it from the first time her hand touched his arm in the forest. His wounds were not only of thorns and blood. They were wounds of loss, of loneliness, of abandonment. When the soup was ready, Alzer poured it into a clean gourd, cooled it with her breath, and offered it. The man hesitated. He stared at the food as though it were a memory, something half-forgotten, fragile. Then slowly, carefully, he lifted the bowl with both hands and drank. The first sip went down slow, heavy. He chewed as if tasting not food, but fragments of a past life. And then, something inside him broke. A tear, sudden and unhidden, slipped from his left eye, rolling into his rough beard. He made no sound. He gave no excuse. He only wept silently, face lowered, as though asking life itself for forgiveness, for the years hunger and grief had stolen from him. Alzer did not move closer. She did not ask. She did not touch. She let him cry. For in that moment, she understood, more than food, more than shelter, what this man needed was firm ground to stand on, and that day, she would be the ground beneath his feet. He remained silent for the rest of the morning, did not give his name, did not say where he had come from. But when his body regained a little strength, he stood again, looked around, found an old nail, and began to repair the kitchen door that had hung crooked for months. Each strike of the hammer echoed softly in the small house, not as noise but as meaning. Alzer swept the yard, fed the chickens, pretending not to notice, yet inside her chest, something stirred. It wasn't love. It wasn't passion. It was respect. Respect for someone who, even broken, tried to stand. For someone who spoke with actions when words would not come. When the door was fixed, he stepped back, sat quietly, and closed his eyes. Not asleep, just quiet, like a man trying to remember that shelter still existed in this world. That afternoon, the neighbor returned, lips sharp with a new insult wrapped in sugar. "Alzer, you'll ruin your name with a strange man in your house. People in the village are already talking." But Alzer said nothing. Before she could, her daughters spoke first, their small voices clear and certain. "He fixed our door," they said. "No uncle ever did that." The words fell heavy, like stones into still water, silencing the air. That night, he ate again. Not quickly, but no longer hesitating. And when he lifted his gaze toward the girls, his lips bent into something faint, almost shy. A smile. Small, fragile, but real. It wasn't pity. It wasn't a debt. It was the kind of gratitude that comes from recognizing a human gesture when you need it the most. And before going to bed, Alzer looked up at the starry sky and whispered, "If we plant good without knowing for whom, maybe one day it comes." Back down the trail hurt, just asking for a hot meal in a quiet place. She still didn't know who he was, but she already knew what he wasn't. He wasn't a threat. He wasn't a burden. He wasn't a lie. He was a man trying to become a man again. And that only someone who's been wounded in both heart and soul knows how to recognize. The sun had barely dried the morning dew when the familiar voice of Dantra, Alzer's late husband's sister, echoed through the yard. It was a sweet voice, but with a bitter aftertaste at the end of every sentence. Dandara never showed up without a reason. She always came wearing a well-pressed dress, Arhurst's smile, and a basket of withered fruit, as if the gesture could cover the sharp tongue she carried in her mouth. "Alzer, my dear, what a nice surprise to find you up so early taking care of the house. What a strong woman you are. After everything you've been through." she said while her eyes scanned every corner of the yard. Her gaze stopped briefly on the chair in the shade, the one where the hunter usually rested his still recovering body. Alzer wiped her hands on the hem of her dress and replied in the calm tone of someone who has learned to listen without absorbing. Life doesn't wait. Dandara, we get up because the girls can't stay on the ground. But Dandara pushed further, and how are the girls must be strange for them. Having a strange man inside the house, right? The provocation came wrapped in honey, but the poison dripped from the edges. Alzer didn't bite the bait. She simply said, they know what respect is. They've learned to recognize someone who doesn't raise a hand, but helps raise a home. Dandara faked a smile, but her eyes revealed irritation. During the conversation, Theman appeared in the background carrying a bucket of water. He passed by in silence as he always did, but he heard everything. Dandara gave him a long look, analyzing him from head to toe as if assessing a threat. Then, turning back to Alzer, she spoke more quietly, her voice soaked in lukewarm venom. You know the men in the village are talking, right? Saying, you've lost your shame, that you're opening your door to just anyone. ... double quotes. The silence that followed was heavy. The hunter, now walking toward the well, didn't react. He just kept walking, the bucket full without spilling a drop. But his eyes, once lifeless, now held a bitter gleam. Alzer noticed, and she also noticed her daughters listening from the doorstep. She didn't yell. She didn't argue. But something inside her cracked, and with a voice choked yet steady, she replied, Dandara, when your brother died, I was left with a debt and the daughters. No one brought flour or a plate or even comfort. And now that my door doesn't creak anymore, that my girls laugh again. You ask who I share my soup with. Dandara had no answer. She blinked, adjusted her hair, and tried to soften. That's not what I meant. It's just that the village is small. People talk, but Alzer wasn't listening anymore. She was looking at her daughters, and in those small, attentive faces, she saw the reflection of her fight. The oldest eyes filled with tears, held a dish towel tight to her chest. The middle one furrowed her brow. The youngest clung to her mother's skirt. Right then, Alzer understood it didn't matter what Dandara said. What mattered was what her daughter saw, and what they saw was a dignified woman hurt, but standing a woman who might be judged by others, but was a role model at home. Dandara left shortly after walking fast. The basket now empty. She left behind more than just words. She left the dust of envy and the trail of those who can't stand see someone bloom outside the garden they water. The hunter returned with the water and placed it beside the makeshift sink. He said nothing, but he picked up a broom and swept the entire yard. Alzer didn't need to thank him. His actions spoke louder. That night, as the wind swayed the hanging oil lamp, Alzer cried. She cried alone, lying next to the girls, trying not to make a sound. She didn't cry because of what was said, but because she knew that with every word she swallowed. Another piece of her soul held strong for one more day. She cried because she felt tired, but couldn't stop. And the daughters, even without understanding everything, moved closer to her in the dark. The middle one wrapped her arms around her neck and whispered, Mama, we know you're good. That was when Alza held back the sobs and pulled all three claws to her chest. She felt that even without a celebration, without public praise, without a voice in the town square, she was winning in that small house between walls of clay and faith. Respect was growing where gossip had tried to plant thorns, and in Al's heart, a certainty was ripening. Those who walk in truth have no reason to fear the gaze of people who hide behind sweet words and bitter souls. The sky woke up overcast. The kind of day when the wind seems to whisper bad news before anything even happens. Alzer woke with her chest tight, a premonition she couldn't explain, dragging behind her like a shadow throughout the morning chores. The house was too quiet for a normal day. The girls should have been helping out in the yard already, but the chickens clucking sounded lonely. Where's Amina? Alzer asked, noticing the absence of her youngest daughter. Always the first to run barefoot into the yard. The sisters exchanged glances. Surprised, she said she was going to pick a flower to put in her hair near the edge of the woods. The middle one replied, her voice trembling. Alzer's heart froze. Yes, the forest's edge was close, but also where animal tracks and hidden dangers lay. Without another word, Alzer dropped the pot she was holding, grabbed a headscarf, and rushed out through the half-latched wooden gate. The hunter, sharpening a hoe nearby, saw her hurry and understood instantly. She didn't have to explain. Just the name Amina leaving her lips was enough. He stood as if the fever that still clung to him had vanished. He grabbed his machete, slung a satchel over his shoulder, and followed her, led by the instinct of someone who knew the twisted paths of the forest. Time passed like a hammer striking slowly. Each minute felt like an hour. Alzer walked the trails around the field, calling her daughter's name with a voice growing hoarse. By the riverbank, nothing. In the banana grove, No sign. And with every echo that answered back, her desperation deepened. When the sun began dipping toward the horizon, a sound in the bushes made her heart stop. It was him. The hunter emerged, face sweaty, clothes caked with dirt, and in his arms, Amina, asleep, barefoot, a tiny flower branch between her fingers, leaves stuck in her hair. She was alive. She was safe. But the most chilling part was what he whispered, just for Alzer to hear. There were jaguar tracks nearby. She was sleeping by a rock, as if something had been watching over her. Alzer dropped to her knees. The earth couldn't hold the weight of the emotion rising through her. She took her daughter in her arms, pressed her against her chest, and cried with the strength of someone who had almost lost everything. The other girls came running, forming a circle of arms and sobs around their sister. And in that moment, between damp earth and a darkening sky, Alzer looked at the man standing beside her, dirty, exhausted eyes, shimmering with emotion. He was no longer the stranger from the forest, no longer the nameless wounded man. He was the one who entered the woods without hesitation, the one who chose to save something that wasn't his dot. And in the gaze they exchanged, there was no romance, no promises, just recognition. Alzer saw him, and he saw her as equals, as two survivors finally allowing themselves to trust Dot. From that day on, something shifted in the village. The gossip turned to silence. The suspicious looks became shy nods. Some even said, "That man's not just anyone." The rescue story spread fast, and those who once whispered behind her back now murmured differently. There was respect in the air, a respect that wasn't bought or demanded. It was planted through action and harvested in tears. That night, after the improvised bath, and tucking the girls in with the worn-out sheet, Alzer sat on the doorstep. The hunter was there beside her, wordless, just looking at the sky, as if searching for stars he recognized. And then, for the first time since arriving, he spoke. "If she had died, I wouldn't have survived it." That was all. But for Alzer, it was enough. She looked at him, eyes wet, and said, "The forest's taken a lot from me, but today it gave something back. It wasn't the end of pain. It wasn't the beginning of love. It was a moment, a bond, a wordless pact. And in that pact, the silent certainty that something new, strong, and rare was being born. Not just between man and woman, but between two souls that had recognized each other in pain, in action, and in care. The village would still talk plenty, but on that day, the only voice that mattered was the one from the heart, and it whispered, "The good you do in silence." One day speaks louder than any wicked tongue. The days following Amina's rescue were filled with a strange calm, the kind of stillness that settles after a storm. But just before some important truth is revealed, the house felt more alive. The girls, once wary, now approached the man with respectful curiosity. He was still reserved, but now he smiled at the little ones, helped patch the cracked clay walls, gathered firewood without being asked. His presence, once heavy, now felt like part of the home, as if at last he'd found a place to rest his weary soul. Alzer watched it all from afar, with the eyes of someone who had seen many things shift shape and color. She knew that silent kindness sometimes hid deep wounds, but she also knew how to recognize when someone wanted to start over. And the act of bringing her daughter back from the forest, risking his own life, had said more than any confession could. It was on a cloudy afternoon with the smell of rain on the wind that he came and sat on the bench under the mango tree where Alzer was mending the hem of one of the girls' skirts. He sat slowly, eyes on the worn dirt floor, and said, "You deserve to know who you're sharing water and shelter with." She didn't respond. She kept sewing, but her ears listened intently. His voice was rough, like someone who hadn't spoken much in years, and every word felt pulled from deep inside, through pain. He said his name was Obasi, that he came from a faraway land beyond the northern hills, that he had once been an elite hunter, trained to read tracks like stories written in the sand. He was respected, feared, sought after by many. But one day, during an ambush driven by greed and to fight over territory, he saw his own brother fall beside him, shot by someone who once called him comrade. His brother's death was the breaking point. That day, he said, "I dropped my weapon, burned my maps, tore up the contracts. I didn't kill anyone that day, but I died with him." Then he ran, vanished into the forest like a man seeking to forget. He walked for days with no direction, survived on roots, slept on stones, ran from people. I thought the woods would bury me alive, and for a while they did. Alzer listened in silence. Her teary eyes didn't just carry sorrow, they carried recognition. She too knew what it meant to lose someone in an instant, to carry a weight no one could see, but that crushed you all the same. When he finished speaking, she set the needle down, looked him in the eye, and said, A monster doesn't take care of daughters. That aunt is a Bari lowered his head. That simple sentence broke something inside him. It wasn't a pardon. It wasn't absolution. It was recognition. And more than that, it was an outstretched hand, free of judgment. Abridge. Exactly what Alzer had once asked for in her silent prayer. In the days that followed, he spoke more. Little by little, he shared stories of his brother, of old camps, of the forest silence. Alzer, in return, told stories of her husband, of her daughters, of the hard days after becoming a widow. It was as if two rivers had begun to meet. Slowly, but with purpose, the girl started calling him Uncle Ober. The youngest even curled up beside him. When storms returned to shake her dreams, the house, once fragile, now seemed to stand on stronger pillars, and Alzer, though she made no promises to herself, began walking with a lighter weight on her back. The village watched from a distance. Some talked, others stayed silent, but no one could deny something had changed in that man, and those who looked into Obis as he watched Alzer's daughters could see more than gratitude. They saw a genuine desire to care, not for praise, but because there in that yard of clay and faith, he had rediscovered something. The world had long denied him belonging. And on a calm night, under a full moon that lit the paths and deepened the stillness of the village, Abbasi turned to Alzer and said, "I didn't know it was still possible to become a man again after so many falls. You all reminded me." Alzer held his hand firmly and replied, "Here, we don't ask where you came from. We watch what you plant." In that sentence, there was everything: forgiveness, hope, and the certainty that not every past is a sentence. Sometimes it's just the crooked road God uses to lead us to the right place. And in that place, truth can bloom, even after being buried for a long, long time. The weather had turned. The sky darkened early that morning, as if the day itself didn't want to happen. The scent of wet earth hung heavy in the air, and the animals were restless, like they sensed something was about to unfold. Ori, still carrying the wounds of his past on both body and soul, decided to go out hunting early, not out of duty, but out of honor. He wanted to bring meat home to give back to the girls who now called him uncle, with the ease of those who asked for nothing in return. He wanted to show with action, and not words, that he was there to stay. Alzer asked him not to go. "The rain's coming down hard today. You don't need to do this now." But he insisted, "Trust me, I'll be back before dark." And left with his old machete at his waist, a bundle of rope slung over his shoulder, and eyes steady as if heading into more than just brush, as if facing his own ghosts. The hours dragged. Thesky turned to lead. The rain came hard, pounding the clay roof in anger. The girls played inside, but Alzer paced the house, trying to hide the unease churning inside her. Each thunderclap echoed in her chest, and when the sun began to set, and still no sign of him, something deep inside her screamed. She slipped on her sandals, grabbed a lantern, and stepped onto the trail carrying Oasis's name in her heart. No weapon, no help, only courage. That kind of courage only mothers, widows, and wounded women know. The kind that rises when there's no other choice. The trail was slippery. Branches cut her arms. Mud clung to her feet, but Alzer didn't stop. She called his name loud, then softer, then only with her eyes. The forest answered with silence, and the noises of animals dot until a clearing. She saw what no heart ever wants to see. Obasi collapsed on the ground, caught in an iron trap clamped around his leg. Blood trickled slowly, mixing with mud. His eyes were open, filled with pain, but more than pain. Surprise at the sight of her there. She ran to him, fell to her knees in the mud without hesitation. Tried to open the trap with her bare hands, crying in fury, fear, and helplessness. "I already lost one man, not this one," she shouted, feet buried in mud, soul ablaze. The words shot out like arrows, cutting through time, through trauma, through the shame of feeling what she felt. Obasi tried to stop her. "You'll get hurt, ... but she didn't listen. She used a branch for leverage, braced herself with her own body, and with a dry snap, forced the trap open. He passed out from the pain. ... And then, in a move no man from the village would ever have imagined, Alzer lifted his heavy body onto her shoulder and began the journey back. Each step was a battle, each breath a prayer. She fell twice, slipped, tore her dress. His blood stained her skin, but she didn't stop. The woman once called weak, the one people said wouldn't survive without a husband, was now crossing the forest with a man on her back and a thunderstorm in her chest. When she reached the village, some people approached in shock. Others just watched. She asked nothing, just walked through them with a sweaty, dirt-streaked face and eyes burning with fire. She laid Obasi on the straw mat, cleaned his wounds, and burned the used cloths in the yard. The daughters helped in silence. They knew something far greater than a rescue had just taken place. That night, his body shook with fever. Alzer stayed by his side, changing compresses, praying in silence, whispering old proverbs. Those who save a life carry scars of honor. A woman who loves with courage heals what the world never learned to protect. She wasn't saying them for him. She was saying them for herself to remember that this wasn't weakness. This was power. Obasa survived. The fever broke 2 days later. But the village was never the same. The gossip turned to orb. Judgment turned to respect. The men who used to laugh at her in the square now looked away. The women greeted her with a nod. And the daughters looked at their mother like one looks at a miracle made of flesh and clay. She didn't just save Obasi from the forest. She saved herself from another abandonment. And the world saw it and learned woman alone is not weak. She is fire rising from her own ashes. She is root holding the ground steady while the trunk bleeds. In the early morning, when he opened his eyes and saw Alzer asleep in the chair, still holding his hand, he simply whispered, "Thank you." She didn't respond. But the tired smile at the corner of her lips said everything, because true love doesn't announce itself. It shows up in action, in the mud, in the pain, and in the silence of those who never give up. The village had returned to its rhythm, but something had changed. Not just in Alzer's home, but in the very air. The whispers had quieted. The stares had grown longer, more cautious, more respectful. The woman, once labeled as weak, vulnerable, a widow with 3 daughters and no protection, was now seen through different eyes. But change rarely pleases everyone, especially those used to holding power without ever being questioned. It was on a clear-skied morning that the village chief showed up. His name was Kasango, an old man, firm-spoken and slow-stepping, long accustomed to being the center of decisions. Even when no one else cared about them, he wore a light tunic and carried a staff more for authority than support. 2 younger men followed him as he knocked on Alzer's door without warning, like someone trying to prove they ruled, even over simple gestures. Obasa opened the door. His leg was still bandaged, recovering from the wound, but his body, though injured, held the upright posture of someone who had survived worse. The chief didn't greet him, just stared and said, "We want to speak with Alzer." She appeared seconds later, wiping her hands on a cotton cloth. The daughters were in the backyard. Her face didn't show fear, only alertness. She knew visits like this were never random, and when Kasango spoke, her suspicion was confirmed. "Alzer, you know we like you. You're a woman of respect, always cared for your daughters, honored your late husband's name, but there are concerns." He paused dramatically as if expecting submission. He didn't get it. "This man," he said, nodding toward Obasi, "is not known to us. No one knows where he came from. And the men in the village are saying your house is becoming a shelter for outsiders that could bring trouble. So Dewey thought of a solution." Obasa stepped forward to speak, but Alza raised her hand gently to stop him. She looked at the chief with the calm only long pain teaches and asked what solution. Kasango took a step closer. Speaking lower now but firmly, "We offer protection. We can ensure no one bothers you or your daughters. But for that he needs to leave. You understand? To preserve order, reputation. There are certain things that don't suit a woman alone." The silence that followed weighed more than any Sunday sermon. Even the birds seemed to go quiet. Alzer stared at him for several seconds. Then she took a breath, lifted her chin, and replied without raising her voice, but with a firmness that could split stone. "Protection from those who can't even care for their own homes is of no use, Tome." The phrase fell like lightning. The 2 young men flanking Kasango looked away. The chief palled but tried to maintain his posture. "You're refusing to heed the advice of the village elder." She stepped forward. "I'm not refusing advice. I'm refusing impositions. This man you call a stranger was the only one who went into the forest to save my daughter. While you all discussed reputation, he carried her blood in his arms. While you spoke of protection, he swept my yard and fixed my door." Obas remained silent, but his eyes glistened. The daughters had crept closer, quietly. They were there listening, learning and Alzer hands, still gripping the cloth. "Finished. If the Ville's order depends on taking away the only one who reached out when I needed it most, then that order doesn't represent me." Kasango tried to respond, but even his presence was already unraveling. His voice no longer held authority. He knew it, and he knew it even more when he turned to leave, and saw some of the village women standing at a distance listening. One nodded in silence, another crossed her arms. None spoke, but their eyes said everything. The silence after the chief's departure was louder than any shout. Obasi stepped forward, took Alzer's hand, and placed it against his chest. "You didn't have to do that," he said. She answered in a low, steady voice. "I did because I need to look into my daughter's eyes and know they saw a woman standing, not a shadow bowed." That night the village slept differently, not out of fear, but because something had broken and something else had risen. An old hierarchy built on control had been challenged, and in its place, respect was born. Not asked for, not demanded, earned by someone who, even in silence, did what no one else had the courage to do. Alzer didn't win with shouting, nor with fighting. She won with truth, and truth, when spoken by someone who has suffered enough, carries the weight of 1,000 judges, and the power to change even what once seemed unchangeable. Time passed like wind through the leaves, quietly, but leaving its mark. The wound in Oasis's leg healed, but the memory of that night when Alzer carried him through the forest like she was carrying a piece of her own story remained. He was no longer a stranger. He was part of the house, part of the routine, part of the lives of those girls who now called him our strong uncle, as naturally as breathing. The village no longer whispered with the same venom. Gossip had given way to curious glances. The women who once crossed the street to avoid looking at Alzer now stopped to ask how the girls were. Some even sought her advice on planting, on motherhood, on how to grow strong without growing hard. Alzer, without boasting, listened, replied, smiled with the quiet wisdom of someone who had been trampled, but never turned to dust. It was on a simple afternoon under a clear sky, and the smell of roasting corn that Obasi called the girls one by one for a talk. They sat beneath the mango tree, the 3 of them lined up like sprouts from the same root. He spoke calmly, looking each one in the eye. Before anything else, I need your yes. I want to marry your mother, but only if you all wanted to, because this house only makes sense if your hearts live in it too. The eldest, already beginning to understand life's deeper layers, smiled and said, we already see you as part of us. All that was missing was the question. The middle one, gentle as soft rain, placed her hand over his and said, if it means seeing her this happy every day, then yes. The youngest, who still mistook love for a strong hug, simply leaped into his lap and shouted, yay! That same day, Obasi went to Alzer. He didn't give a speech. He didn't bring a ring. He brought his presence. He said he didn't know how to make pretty promises, but he knew how to sweep the yard, plant, care for the girls, and never turn away during storms. He said he wasn't perfect, but he was whole, and that if she would let him, he wanted to share a life. Alzer listened in silence, eyes slowly welling with tears. And when he finished, she simply nodded and said, I never had a party, but I've learned that peace is worth more than loud music. They married a week later. No invitations, no white dress, no fancy venue, just the yard of their home, their daughters as witnesses, and the neighbor bringing a corn cake on a banana leaf. The blessing came from old Gimbo, who prayed more with his eyes than with words. May this union be like a field, hard to keep, but beautiful to harvest. And so it was. Obasi wore his best shirt, not new but clean. Alzer tied her hair with a blue cloth that had belonged to her mother. The girls ran barefoot through the yard with flowers in their hair, and the neighbors, they came not out of obligation, but out of respect. Some stood, others sat on wooden benches, all quiet as the couple held hands. There was no applause, but there was emotion, the kind that doesn't need noise to be heard. It was a wedding without fireworks, but full of truth, without luxury, but rooted deep. That union didn't just celebrate love between a man and a woman. It celebrated the victory of a woman who alone raised daughters, endured judgment, faced the forest, and still never closed her heart to affection. And Obasi, the man who once fell bleeding at the edge of the woods, now stood tall, as if he had finally found solid ground. A father by choice, a partner by honor, a friend by merit. He wasn't replacing anyone. He was simply building his place beside someone who had never given up on loving bravely. That night, lying on the simple mat, they listened to the rain begin to fall outside. Obosi held Alzer's hand and said, now I've finally found a place where my past doesn't weigh me down anymore. She answered with a calm look, because here we water the future. And so without fireworks, but with soul, a new family was born, not of blood, but of choice. A family the village would learn to respect, not out of fear, but by example. Because sometimes the most beautiful love is the one that blooms in the middle of pain and blossoms in silence. After the wedding, Alzer's house didn't gain new walls, fancy furniture, or a white picket fence like the homes of the village's wealthy. But something within it and around it began to change with a strength you couldn't see, only feel. A quiet transformation made of gestures, glances, and small decisions that together built a revolution without noise. The daughters began studying with more focus. Aosi, still healing, built a small table in the corner of the living room with a shelf made from scrap wood to hold the notebooks and books that used to lie scattered. He made a chalkboard from an old plank and charcoal. This is the place where knowledge grows, he'd say, always smiling. And there at night, after dinner, he would sit with the girls and read aloud, even stumbling over some words. Alzer, seated beside them, would embroider and listen. But what was heard in that room wasn't just reading. It was the building of a new future. The little garden behind the house, once modest, grew strong. With Oasis's help, the soil was treated, the seeds replanted with more care. Soon, firmer beans, taller corn, and hardier cassava began to grow. Everything that sprouted there carried the mark of resilience. It was as if the land recognized those who worked it with dirty hands but clean hearts. The house that once drew dismissive glances had become a reference point. Some women in the village, those abandoned by their husbands, began knocking on Alzur's door. At first they came with excuses. I just came for a bit of salt. Would you happen to have a boulder leaf? But little by little they came to be heard. And Alzur without pride opened her door, offered a bench, hot tea, and her ears. She didn't preach. She simply told her story. And in each phrase, she planted seeds in other people's hearts. Obasi never imposed himself, but he never hid either. Slowly, the men of the village began to see him differently. First with suspicion, then with respect. Some asked for help in the fields, others for tips on hunting traps or advice on treating knee pain. He responded humbly, always nodding in thanks. He never wanted to be a leader, but he became an example in the town square where only men's voices once echoed. People now stopped when Alzur spoke. She spoke little, but when she did, everyone listened. She was no longer the widow with 3 girls. She was the woman who saved a man, the mother who carried life's weight in her body and soul, and still walked upright with dignity. The daughters saw it all. They learned that strength isn't shouting, it's staying. That love isn't expensive gifts, it's steady presence. That a simple house can be the safest castle when the foundation is built with respect and faith. And so without fanfare, without parties or medals, change came invisible to those who only see with their eyes, loud to those who feel with the heart. Proof that when love takes root, it doesn't need announcements. It blooms even on hardened ground, even beneath cloudy skies, even surrounded by those who once doubted. And those passing by Alzur's house no longer saw just a woman alone with 3 daughters. They saw a family forged in pain, lifted in silence, and held together by a faith that needed no explanation, because it was lived every day in every gesture, in every harvest, in every story shared beneath the shade of the mango tree. It was a morning like any other, the kind where bird song feels clearer and the scent of corn porridge blends with a soft breeze drifting in from the forest. When Obasi approached Alzur, eyes glistening with the silence she already knew well, they were in the yard. The daughters played with dolls made of corn husks and cloth scraps. The sun warmed the earth slowly. In his hands, Obasi held a small bundle and a certainty in his chest. I need to go for a few days, just a week. I have to return to a place I've been running from for too long. But I promise I'll be back before the next full moon. Alzur didn't ask questions. She simply nodded with that kind of look that had learned how to trust. Without clinging, she knew some journeys aren't about distance. They're about release. And he, with all the calm carried in his strong frame, kissed her forehead and embraced the girls with a tenderness that felt like a soul's farewell. Left with a small bag on his shoulder. No horse, no hurry, only purpose. The week passed slowly. Time dragged its feet. Alzur cared for the garden, the girls, the house, as she always had. But there was a different silence in Oasis's absence. It wasn't emptiness. It was anticipation. The youngest asked every day, "He's really coming back, Mama?" And Alzur answered with what she felt, not what she knew. "He is anyone who plants with truth always comes back to harvest." On the 7th day, as the sun began to dip and the sky wore that soft orange that signals something good, a bossy appeared on the horizon. He walked with firm steps, a thick cloth draped over one shoulder, and eyes full of something he had never shown before. Not sadness, wholeness. He carried a large leather sack and a dark wooden box with old locks. When he arrived, he knelt before Alzur and the girls, opened the bundle slowly, and began to reveal what he brought. First, new tools, hoes, machetes, shovels, ropes. Then, a pile of children's books, some with colorful pictures, others with stories of savanna animals and ancient proverbs, and finally, a small wooden boat, collapsible with short paddles and seats for 4. "For when we want to go farther," he said, looking straight into Alzur's eyes. She didn't understand right away. So he explained he had returned to his birth village, faced the faces that had once judged him, visited his brother's grave, and in a symbolic act, accepted the inheritance he had once rejected. A small chest with coins, his father's tools, and part of a land no one else wanted. Obasi hadn't come back richer. He came back whole. "I never wanted anything that came from pain," he said. "But now I understand. Pain only becomes a curse when we run from it. I accepted what was mine, not out of greed, but because now I have someone to give it to truly. Alzer held his hand. The girls gathered around the books like they were treasure. The youngest climbed into the boat and burst into laughter. And there in that packed earthy yard with the scent of wood fire and a soul at peace, something solidified. The promise of the past had been broken, and a new cycle began. That night, sitting around the oil lamp, Abbasi told stories of the place he came from, of his brother, his childhood, his pain, and his return. Alzer listened closely but peacefully. There was no fear anymore, no doubt, no shadow. Only presence, real, steady, nurtured. The little boat remained beside the mango tree like a symbol. It wasn't just transport. It was a sign. They could now dream of horizons. They could set out together even without knowing the exact destination. Because those who plant with love and water with respect always find a way. And in the simplicity of that return, Alzer understood. She hadn't saved a man in the forest. It was the act of welcoming him that had saved them both. Because sometimes what God unites isn't just marriage, it's purpose, it's root, it's life. And when the past returns redeemed, it no longer wounds. It teaches and shows that with faith, even pain can become a boat to take you farther together. Alzer didn't just save a broken body in the forest. She healed the heart the world had left behind. When she brought that wounded man into her home, she had no idea what or who she was welcoming. She thought it was just another soul bruised by fate. But with time, she realized she was welcoming the reflection of her own fight. The story of someone who, like her, had lost much and yet still had the strength to love again. And Abbasi, in turn, didn't just find shelter. He found dignity. He found ground beneath his feet. He found a woman who didn't question his past but admired his present. He found 3 little girls who called him with affection, who listened with bright eyes, who laughed with him as if he had always been there. And that can't be bought, can't be forced, only earned with truth. Their story wasn't made of instant miracles or material riches. It was built in quiet moments, in mud-caked feet, in whispered prayers by the fire. It was built in eye contact, in choosing trust when the world pointed fingers, in rising again after each stumble. They didn't need applause to know they had won, because the victory that matters isn't the one others celebrate. It's the one your heart feels. And there's felt peace, felt certainty, felt rooted. Alizia, once seen as a burden, was now seen as strength. The woman so many had dismissed for being alone was now a guide for others, who also carried children in their arms and wounds in their chests. And Obey, who the world had tried to turn into a beast, proved himself a whole man, not through words, but through action that the village learned from them. Learned that Apperson's worth isn't in appearance or background or anyone's opinion. It's in their gestures, in their steadiness, in their courage to keep going when everything says to stop, and most of all, in their choice to love, even without the promise of being loved back. Together, they showed the truth. A woman with daughters isn't a burden. She's an entire forest. She withstands drought, storm, plague, and abandonment, and still stands tall. And sometimes a new beginning doesn't announce itself. It arrives quietly in the form of a shared meal, a mended door, a child rescued in the woods. But when it comes, it brings roots deeper than any past. And the lesson that remained carved into the clay of their home, echoed in the words now shared across the village, is simple and eternal. The good done in silence one day returns and blooms in the form of peace. Because divine justice is never in a rush, but it never fails. And when it comes, it doesn't need a stage. It only needs a soul that kept loving even through the fire. Like Alzer, like so many who still believe it's worth doing what's right even when the whole world says otherwise. If this story touched your heart, let us know where you're watching from. Leave a comment below. We'd love to hear from you. Don't forget to like the video, share it with your friends and family, and subscribe to the channel. That really helps us keep bringing you real and emotional stories like this one. Thank you for being part of our